get to that Bangladesh case in the second half of this programming, but I want to get to Fakhuri, who's the Minister of Planning and International Cooperation in Jordan. Your name has been used many times here because Jordan really was the first compact. It's one of the most affected countries, has maybe the most progress thus far, but the challenges are really deep. David outlined those kind of three categories of challenges. How do you get from where you are now, which is it was already a big success to get a work permits target. How do you get from that to refining the projects to the point where they're having the kinds of outcomes that everyone wants to be accountable for here?
Thank you, Raj, and thank you to the Center for hosting almost the same panel 1 year ago. And let me put this also, and I think David did a very good job in actually positioning what the Jordan context is today and what we're trying to balance and trying to do more on the refugee side and the way we deal with the refugee influx and so on. For us, I think, I remember very well in March 2015, I wrote a letter to President Kim, Dr. Kim of the World Bank, arguing in that letter, because I started to see what the fiscal space is doing to a host country. I sent a letter to him pitching the case of Jordan and Lebanon jointly and saying as middle-income countries, we're seeing more influx. We have the experience and the knowledge that this is going to be very protracted. It's not going to be resolved anytime soon. And we're seeing our fiscal space deteriorate significantly, that we had to trigger an IMF austerity program, now the second in a row. And it became very clear that something has to give in. If we're not going to get the financing right, it's going to be impossible to do the moral and the right thing. And because you're going to be in a position where you're going to actually say, if I do this to a refugee, I'm going to do less to my own citizen. And that's a very difficult thing to do in anywhere in the world. So think today in the US, what we experienced, think if America had to absorb 65 million people. That's the ratio of what we dealt with. So think 65 million people coming into the US. Don't factor in how much higher the per capita income of the US is, how much water is available, other resources and so on. But think about it as a citizen in America, when you absorb all of a sudden 65 million people, and you're thinking about your tax policy, your job policy, everything else you're trying to do. Do you keep the refugees in the camps? Do you allow them to leave the camps? Do you let them integrate and so on? When you start to ask these questions but understand the scale of that issue, the carrying capacity, what and how much more you can do, I think it starts to bring the difficulty in all of that. And that's why we realized very early on that if we don't get the financing to work well, this is not going to be sustainable. We won't be able to continue doing the great things we've done in Jordan vis-a-vis the different refugee populations. And you're talking to a country today where 1 in 3 in our country is a registered refugee with UNHCR or with UNRWA. Just so you understand, we're not newcomers to this, unfortunately. We've been dealing over 70 years with conflicts around us and hosting refugee populations, and we know the reality of protracted nature of the crisis. So the hard part in all of this, I think, is what we do with the refugees cannot be isolated from the overall economic situation. And what people also forget, especially donors, is that usually when you're neighboring a conflict, that conflict and instability worsens your economic situation. It lowers your growth rate. So for us as Jordan, just so you know it, we were highly integrated economically to the markets within the region. Our big export markets in the region were Iraq, Syria, Egypt, Libya, Yemen. And you know what happened to these countries. So when you lose your markets, you have less investment, you have more uncertainty, you have terrorism, you have violence all around you. All your economic indicators are going down. So your own population is getting worse off economically. And at the same time, donors are asking you to do more with the refugees. And we started to do the things we did with the refugees, not because anyone asked us, because it was the right thing, it was the moral thing, it was the legal thing to do in the right way vis-a-vis the refugees. But there's a limit to how much a country can do. So while we were dealing with all of that, the conflicts disrupted the markets for us. All of this made it harder for us fiscally to sustain the ability to do what we're doing, and hence the Global Concessionary Financing Facility. But the reality still, it came in 5 years late, and it's still a battle year in, year out to get the donors to subsidize or give in some grants to mix it in the financing. And then the overall financing that comes in is still much less than the increased costs of what we're doing. So we deal with $1.5 billion every year of direct costs of providing public services to the refugees. And you get maybe a couple $100 million a year of borrowing money. These are not grants from IBRD. So you're increasing the debt of your own nation and your own citizens, but you're just asking that it's more concessionary. And this is the gap that you're confronting. So the scale of these initiatives, they came in late, but they also, to sustain them, is getting harder and harder. And there has to be, within that discussion, we need also the IMF to be sitting. It's not just the World Bank. Because what happens ultimately in these countries that are facing these situations, all of us, is that we fiscally start to crash. Hence, the IMF steps in. Hence, you have a very strong austerity program, where we had to do $5 billion from 2012, inclusive of this year, of fiscal measures, meaning we've taken subsidies away and we've increased taxes on our own population to remain fiscally stable, whilst at the same time, we're trying to do all what we're doing in that financing gap. So you have to understand that mix.
Let me just ask you this one. I want to bring Nancy in, but I want to ask you one thing, which is, you're absolutely right about the challenges, the scale of the challenges. But there is a kind of an elegant solution here that you and the bank and others came up with, which included the idea that, okay, yes, only maybe 350 million in grants have been raised out of 1.5 billion, which is the target. It's not enough money yet, but you've got these special economic zones. The EU agreed to reduce tariffs for exporting of, for example, garments, so you could create jobs, you could get refugees into those jobs. You've got this elegant solution, or at least the beginning of it. How is that going? I know it looks maybe more elegant on paper than in the reality of how it works on the ground. But very briefly, give us a sense of what's your picture from how it's going?
The Jordan Compact, which we proposed in London in 2016, was very much because of our historical experience, realizing that the refugees should be looked at as a development asset. And we always thought in Jordan that that's the right approach. I mean, it's part of our melting pot, it's part of our geopolitical positioning, it's part of our history, tradition in terms of how we dealt with waves of people that have crossed into our border. And hence this idea, let's turn this into an economic development opportunity. Let's think of the refugees as a surplus labor pool. So given that, we proposed a holistic framework, the Jordan Compact, which is very much the framework of a lot of the innovation that we're seeing now and hopefully gets factored into the Global Compact on refugees and the Global Compact on displacement. There, we've done, I think, well on increasing funding on a grant basis to the response plans we develop every year in full partnership with the international community, the UN agencies, the INGOs. It's nationally led, nationally owned, and we've seen, compared to 2013, 14, 15, in the last 2 years, the international community provided support to cover 1/3 of the needs. It went up to covering 2/3 of the needs. So there's been an improvement. Of course, there's been 4 years of big deficits that we had to incur that no one compensated you for, and hence the increased debt and fiscal austerity program and all of that. On the education side, we've done very well because we took an approach that you should have no lost Syrian generation on our own territory in Jordan. And we went very aggressively to make sure that we push as many Syrian boys and girls to be in public schools and provide all the support needed for that. On the other reforms, we stayed with the IMF on the austerity reforms because we always acknowledge that if we lose our fiscal stability, then it will be worse off for everyone. And yet, I would argue here we need to be thinking about how much can you pressure a country to do more for refugees while at the same time to do severe austerity. That has not factored into the discussion globally, and we are the case point where this has not yet trickled into the model of doing that.
And as you mentioned,
and
you're
on the
asked
rules,
to take on debt
yes,
in this
course,
context.
Of course.
Yeah.
And where we've seen less progress was on the trade side. So we thought, could we think of producing products made by Jordanians and refugees, a type of a brand or a label of a product? And I think this is where we failed, and I think we should put the most support, is this idea, can we look at ways to integrate ventures, investments, and factories into the global supply chains? Because there you create sustainable solutions that don't need aid, but they make us actually come up with good solutions. We did a great success with IKEA, where IKEA came in. We established in Jordan a facility with 500 women, 250 Syrians, 250 Jordanians, and they were creating products designed by IKEA, and IKEA purchases them through their global supply chain. That's been very successful. They sold in IKEA Jordan, they're going to be selling in New York, and they're going to go global. If we can get more global corporations to go away from CSR, but to really go into this model, I think this has a chance to do great success. And the EU system was trying to do that, which is get companies to export under easier arrangements. I think this is an area where we really need to push the envelope, because I think this is where we deal with all the problems.
Right.
Because you create jobs, real jobs, into new markets when your regional markets are shrinking and getting worse off. And it takes a lot of effort, of course, to do that. But I think in addition to the financing, I see the trade export side is the other area where we could really be more creative in doing solutions.
So we will, Minister, a final thought.
65 million people is probably now, in terms of forced displacement, is the largest growing country in the world, if you look at it. And I think just the way that the Syria crisis rudely awakened the European continent, when people started to go in the boats and flood the borders, I think this crisis and its implications globally are going to continue to rudely awaken the world. So what we're doing here is very important. Prevention without diplomacy and political leadership is not going to happen. I mean, clearly. So what we're all doing does not mean we're also giving up the political tracks, pushing on the Geneva process for Syria and all of that. And we can't abandon that, but we're also trying to deal with the day in, day out realities that we have to deal with. We are now moving with the World Bank and the IMF to go into the guarantee scheme, where we're taking what we piloted in Jordan under the Global Concessionary Financing Facility to move into a 5-year bigger program with IBRD, where donors come in because there's a limited headroom on financing, and they give in, not cash, just guarantees to help us borrow more and manage the financing as we continue the IMF program and that.
Cheaper.
So we are quite advanced on this. On Saturday, we have a critical donor meeting with the World Bank on that. So Jordan, we are going to keep fighting the fight, and we're going to leave no stone unturned, and we're going to remain holistic. It's our will to survive, and it's our voice to keep the world conscious awakened. And we're not going to back down, and I want people to leave the room saying, yes, it's a challenge, yes, it's growing, but we can together collectively push this and stay the course and change the way we bring in financing for development to help fragile or conflict-affected states, and hopefully align the incentives correctly that you are rewarding those who are doing the right thing at the right time.
And I think that is the storyline.